Hi folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness. We've reached episode 4 of Star Trek Picard, an episode entitled Absolute Candor. So it's time for another review, and this one is a doozy, but for all the wrong reasons. In my previous video, I said that you can generally get a feel for the overall tone and feel of where a show is going by episode 3 or 4. And in this one, my worst fears have been confirmed. I'm sure there will be people out there who think that Picard's a great show, and all I can say to that is each to their own. Overall, most people tend to gauge their like of something with a subjective perspective, which is fine. There are plenty of songs, films and television episodes that I really liked, even loved, that were objectively really bad, but there's just something about them that did it for me. However, as I watched episode 4 of Picard, my list of objective and subjective negatives just got bigger and bigger. I don't want to collectively judge this series, as I am going to try and look at it on an episode by episode basis. Hopefully those of you who have watched my videos so far will come to recognise that that's what I'm trying to do, particularly with episode 1, which I really didn't think was that bad at all, actually. Episode 4, though, is very problematic. I'll go into my subjective and objective issues shortly, but I first want to rattle through the plot with a few niggly observations peppered in along the way. There's quite a lot to get through here, so we'll start this episode with yet another flashback to events around about the time of the synth attack on Mars. This appears to be par for the course with this show. It was undoubtedly mandated by Alex Kurtzman, probably a holdover from his days working on Lost, something of an interesting narrative device when Lost first began, but even that show wore it out. Nowadays it's a cliche, it's tired, it's used irrespective of whether or not it's a necessary plot driver. In this flashback, we visit planet Vashti and the Romulan relocation hub located there. The hub is home to many Romulans, who Picard helped to rescue from the Romulan supernova. We see a young Romulan boy running through the marketplace and stealing something from a stall, presumably it's a piece of fruit or vegetable. The stall owner shouts at him, calling him a sister boy. Interesting that the writers use this term in an age where media seems to be increasingly obsessed with non-binary gender labels and terminology. The boy shouts back in Romulan but with subtitles, "Bite me." And this is one of my principal complaints about contemporary J.J. Abrams, Kurtzman, Bad Robot, Secret Hideout style Star Trek using 20th and 21st century language, terminology and slang in a fictional future time period that's not used this kind of terminology previously. Enterprise was a little bit looser in this regard because the time period of that show was relatively much closer to our contemporary time, but the late 24th century is depicted as largely devoid of this kind of thing. The same is true of strong cursing language. Yes, the naysayers note that there is swearing in the original series and Next Generation films, but even that's a minimum, and it only seems to appear under extreme circumstances. In the Kurtzman Trek universe, it just comes out of nowhere with far more regularity. But I digress at this point. The issue here is that "bite me" is an American latter 20th century phrase, more at home with the likes of Bart Simpson than a Romulan child 500 years later. But back to the story. Picard beams into the colony, dressed like a British colonialist visiting the natives on safari, maybe an attempt to say something about Patrick Stewart's nationality. In any case, Picard is crowded by locals presenting an almost revering attitude towards him, more colonial messaging maybe. Picard enters the home of a bunch of Romulan warrior nuns, more ham-fisted and superficial strong women messages from the writers here. He's greeted by the Romulan boy, whose name we learn is Elnor. Elnor's a snotty little brat, far more interested in what Picard has brought him as a gift rather than being pleased to see him. The head nun reminds the viewers that Picard has always said that he doesn't like children and says he dislikes displays of emotion. Not exactly true of Picard, but it was always a general rule of thumb for the character in The Next Generation. However, here, Picard reminds us that this is not the Trek you remember when he retorts, "Not at all," and says to Elnor, "I like you very much." The head nun delivers the first of many poorly conceived and truly awful lines of dialogue on display in this episode when she says, "A promise is a prison." Presumably the writers thought they were being really profound with this one. We learn that Elnor is the only male in a house full of women warrior nuns. More poorly thought out identity politics posing as story ideas here. The head nun says he is loved, but he does not belong with us. The embedded message, men don't belong with women. Picard is seen teaching Elnor to fence and reading the Three Musketeers to him. In my notes for this episode, I also felt that the producers of the show were trying to create a Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings vibe and aesthetic here, with the home of the warrior nuns and the nature of their order. Picard receives a message from Raffi telling him that the synths have attacked Mars. I was surprised we didn't get another visual of Mars burning at this point, but it didn't appear, and the flashback ends. In the present, we are on board the La Serena, the ship procured by Picard in the previous episode. On the bridge, Captain Rios is smoking his cigar, listening to 20th century music. Yes, I like listening to 16th century music all the time. And reading a book about, as he tells Dr. Jurati, existential pain, living with the consciousness of death and how it defines us as human beings. We have an attempt here on the part of the writers, presumably to give us an enigmatic and profound air to Rios, and also make the writers look like they're really good at scripting this show. They failed, by the way, at least with regards to characterisation anyway. Dr. Jurati spouts a load of wisecracking quips and one-liners, doubtlessly to make the character quirky and endear her to the viewer. She tells Rios that she used to live with a guy who liked paper books, but this guy was her dad, and she used to go at him for reading paper books, and he just had to put up with it. She says that space is really boring. What that subliminally says about Star Trek on the part of the writers is anybody's guess. She tells Rios to go figure, more 20th century slang. I noticed here also that Alison Pill, who plays Jurati, makes a load of weird shapes and expressions with her mouth. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it for the rest of the episode. On several occasions, she screws up her mouth and lips, like she's chewing on a wasp. Look out for it the next time you watch the episode, you can see it on screen. Raffi comes to the bridge and confirms that Michelle Hurd's acting in this show is absolutely awful. I did a check on Hurd's acting career. It appears that she's had quite a long and varied one. I also checked out some of the shows that she's been in, some clips of the shows that she's been in. Her acting was alright. I wondered if it was something to do with the acting direction on Star Trek Picard, but then I remembered that this episode was directed by Jonathan Frakes, who played Riker on Star Trek Next Generation. He's directed countless Trek franchise episodes, 2 Star Trek Next Generation movies, a raft of other TV shows and films. He's a proven director with a documented penchant for working well with other actors. In short, it can't be the directing, so I can only assume that Michelle Hurd just can't be bothered with this character, and she is, as the adage goes, phoning it in. Raffi then man-bashes by moaning about Picard's course change to planet Vashti. She says men can't even make a guilt trip without using a starship. Picard's seen on the holodeck of the ship, where he's recreated his study from his French chateau. I couldn't help but feel here that the production decision was intended to either save money on sets, or it was a way to reinsert scenes that were originally intended to have taken place at Picard's actual chateau in the series. Famously, Star Trek Picard went through extensive pickups, as they call them, so the latter may very well be the case. Picard encounters Rios' EMH, we saw in the previous episode. We learn here that it's in fact an emergency hospitality hologram, whatever one of those is. Rios tells Picard that, in his words, he hates that fucking hospitality program. Trite dialogue here. If he hates him that much, why doesn't he just delete the program? Jurati then tippy-toes into the holodeck, apparently again to remind the viewer how quirky the character is. She says, "Is this a secret meeting? Am I technically part of the crew now?" Oh, how I laughed. Raffi delivers another man-bashing towards Rios for following Picard's orders without question. You just obeyed, like a good Starfleet officer. In a contrived last-minute thought-type line of dialogue, we're told that there's a Romulan rebirth movement on Vashti, and we get the impression that this movement will be portrayed as a so-called extremist movement. Raffi metaphorically scratches her fingernails down the blackboard when she calls Picard JL. Very, very annoying. The intention here is to tell the viewers that Raffi's really close to Picard because she calls him that, but then she subtly insults him a few seconds later when she says that Picard wants to hire a nun. Quirky Jurati responds with another one-liner about the nuns and asks, is that a real thing? We then learn that the warrior nuns are called the Koat Malat. They are, according to Picard, the bestest ever warriors that's ever been seen. Apparently they also help him to relocate 250,000 Romulan refugees. They have a primary teaching of absolute candor, which Picard describes as total communication of emotion without any filter between thoughts and words. Sounds like a description of the writers of contemporary Star Trek. No filter, all emotion, no art of storytelling, no common sense. Jurati then asks, anyone think that the way of absolute candor is potentially annoying? This was just another attempt to make Jurati quirky and likeable. The line reflects my thoughts on many viewers. Yes, it is annoying, but then so is this episode. Next we jump to the Borg Cube, and Soji is watching a recording of a Romulan talk show. Yes, a media talk show in the late 24th century, more cribbing of 20th century paradigms. This show features Romda, the Romulan ex-Borg from the previous episode. It was recorded before she went cuckoo from her Borg experiences. In the recording, she says, Ganmadan is what ancestors called the day of annihilation, of everything, all life everywhere, when all the shackled demons break their chains and answer the call of the destroyer. This is about the only aspect of the episode that fractionally inches the overall narrative of the series forward, but it's only very slightly. We're back on board Rios' ship. It's in orbit of the planet Vashti. The planet's protected by a shield weapons grid. Picard conveniently finds a way to beam through the grid, although it isn't really explained how he did it. It's hinted that it might be something to do with money or something like that, but it's never really answered. At the colony, the Romulans are now very frosty with Picard, with the exception of the co-op Malat. Picard reunites with the head nun and Elnor, who's now grown up, but also a quasi-inverted Kylo Ren. At least that's what I thought the writers were going for here. He's a powerful sword-wielding warrior who doesn't fit in. Another stroppy and brooding character here. Back on the Borg cube, we get the most ridiculous dialogue here between Soji and Narek, the writers trying to make their so-called romance profound and deep. Narek tells Soji that he sees her. Yes, he has eyes. Soji says, "I'm a trusting person, Narek. That's my default. I don't know. You kind of challenged my paradigm." Narek then says something so evocative that I can't even remember what it was, and then asks Soji, "How's the paradigm?" Soji responds, "You're enigmatic." I mean, really, who in the real world speaks like this in everyday conversation? We then get the pair sneaking off into a ventilation corridor. They take off their shoes. Narek makes some weird story about it being a Borg ritual, which it's not. They take off their shoes and they start sliding up and down the corridor and laughing and doing, and then they have a bit of a snog. Soji gets the impression that Narek thinks she's lying about something because her personal records don't add up. Then she has a strop and starts to storm off. Narek reminds her that they are both, as he put it, feeding an insatiable curiosity, which then stops her. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. You really couldn't. Back on the ship, the crew find out that Picard's drawing too much attention to himself on Vashti. Raffi tells him that he needs to beam back to the ship because, conveniently, there's also a Romulan bird of prey on an intercept course. Picard tells Raffi that he needs more time and tells them to do what they have to do. Elnor prepares some food for Picard, which he doesn't want, so Elnor has another strop and throws it on the table and storms off. Picard then tells the head nun that he allowed the perfect to become the enemy of the good. Picard must have been puffing on Raffi's wacky vape before he beamed down, because I haven't got a clue what the writers were trying to say with this line. Picard then asks the nun if Elnor is a co-op Malat, to which she retorts no, and as a man he never can be, which I took as an exclusion of men message. The nun tells Picard he's open-hearted and, apart from his display of reticence, which you always seem to inspire in him, forthright, and his fighting skills are truly formidable. Identity politics again on display here with the message that Picard, the man, brings out the reticence in him, brings out the worst in him, but the warrior woman brought out the strengths and the best qualities in him. Overall, the message here is that he's really good at what he does because of the women, but he can never fit in because he's a man. Contemporary male bashing 101. The nun suggests Elnor commit to Picard, and they recommend a binding ritual. Picard muses that he hopes he doesn't have to go down on his knees for this ritual because his knees aren't very good. Now, surely bad knees aren't a problem in the late 24th century, medical science being what it is. In the past, we've seen it remove Spock's brain, totally replace Worf's entire spinal column, replace Tuvok's right elbow joint, genetically modify Bashir's brain intelligence and hand-to-eye coordination. It gave Geordi new eyes, and oh yes, it replaced Picard's entire heart when he was stabbed by a Nausicaan. So why now are his knees such an issue? Answer: because the writers are shit and they don't know anything about what happened in the past Star Trek shows. Elnor thinks that Picard only wants him to come with him because Picard wants something from him, not because he cares about his well-being. That's actually true, and it says a lot about the way Picard's now being written. If he'd care about Elnor, he would have gone back to Vashti a long time ago. Elnor, realising the truth, has another strop and storms off, although in this instance, I can't say I blame him. Picard then decides to depart, but before he leaves, for some bizarre reason, he walks over to the local canteen, picks up a Romulans only sign, and which is a clear and unsubtle nod towards ethnic segregation on the part of the production team. He throws the sign on the floor, walks over it, and then sits down at a table to be served. We then have an ex-Romulan senator who gets up and tells Picard that he thinks about the way they were abandoned and how they were taken advantage of by the Federation, and generally goads Picard. Then the senator's posse gets up and they surround Picard. The Romulan says, "You did everything to scatter and divide us." He gives Picard a sword and challenges him to a fight. They begin, but then Elnor turns up. Presumably, he's now not that bothered that Picard doesn't really care about him. That was a quick turnaround, devoid of any explanation, and another example of sloppy, ill-thought-out plotting. Elnor gives the Romulan a chance to stop the fight, which lasts about 5 seconds, and then he chops his head off. Another of many beheadings, I might add, in Kurtzman-era Star Trek. At least it wasn't a baby beheading this time. Picard tells the crowd, "The Federation has failed you. I failed you all. I broke faith with you, and the result was terrible. Pain and loss for all of you, and I am sorry." This is the Federation, and by extension Picard, shaming on the part of the writers. The white man must apologise. But what makes the whole scene absolutely incredulous is that it comes seconds after one of the locals has just been beheaded by Picard's friend, and indirectly as a result of Picard's actions. Note to the writers, make up your bloody mind what you are trying to say with this show. Does anybody stop for a second and say, hang on a minute, I don't think this really works? If they do, Kurtzman probably just says no one will notice, and to those that do, fuck 'em. In any case, one of the beheaded Romulan posse here doesn't seem to care for Picard's apology. He draws a disruptor to shoot him, at which point Picard and Elnor conveniently beam away to safety, even though Picard's crew didn't even know that Elnor was coming with Picard at this point in time, which is another plot hole convenience. On board the ship, Picard berates Elnor for beheading the Romulan and says, I will tell you when to fight and when to refrain. Is that understood? Swear it. Picard then introduces Elnor to Jurati and Raffi. He says of the Koat Malat that, in his words, they bind himself, to a lost cause. More gender-twizzling language here. Raffi scoffs and then says, a boy with a stick. More man-bashing from her. And Jurati just chews on another wasp. Back on the Borg cube, Narek is in bed. His sister Rizzo appears and starts touching him up, feeling him up, attempts to reenact a scene from between Cersei and Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones. They discuss the goal that is to kill Soji, and according to Narek, all of them. We can't do it until we find out where she came from and where the rest of them are, which implies that there are others like Soji and Darj. Rizzo then berates Narek, the subversive male, and then starts throttling him round the neck for no apparent reason and asking, who is she? Doesn't she sort of already know who Soji is? Narek answers she's the destroyer. Rizzo gives Narek one more week to get some answers out of Soji. Back on Rios' ship, it's now under attack from the Romulan bird of prey. Rios activates another hologram who looks like an unkempt version of Rios but does Cheech and Chong impressions. He's called Emmett, by the way, and he fires the ship's weapons. Then another ship turns up and starts firing on the bird of prey. Rios shouts bastard for some seemingly no other reason than because he can. Then they get a hail from the pilot of the new ship asking to be beamed over because the ship has taken severe damage. The ship is destroyed but not before the pilot is recovered, and it is 7 of 9, who bullshitly tells Picard that he owes her a ship. Then she passes out. The end. Well, apart from a preview of next week's episode which looks absolutely excruciating, like fancy dress at the OK Vegas Corral. I'll save my judgments on that one until I've watched it. As for this episode, well, what can I say? And you can probably tell from the tone of my voice throughout this video so far. I've covered most of my gripes as I went through the plot overview. There were so many that it seemed easier to just do it that way. I will come to my subjective view of this episode in a moment, but first let's get objectivity out of the way. This isn't just a bad episode of Star Trek, it's a bad episode of television all around. The acting is lazy, the inter-character dialogue is incredibly weak, there are forced attempts at banter that come over as very artificial, the humour and the quirkiness fails miserably, there are nonsensical character motivations and plot holes left, right and centre, plus the overall serious arc is barely advanced, contributing to probably a total of about 5 minutes of story. Then we've got the love story, for want of a better term, between Soji and Narek. It's actually unintentionally hilarious. It's trite, it's trivial, like a daytime soap opera. The political messages in the episode are poorly thought out, very badly executed, particularly the analogy for immigration and segregation at the Romulan relocation camp. Sorry folks, I know there are people out there who will damn me for this, but the space battle special effects in this episode, don't rate them at all. They're edited too fast, blurry at times, too heavy on the bizarre angles and the lens flares. But again, there's nothing new here with JJ and Kurtzman Trek. And I also think I caught another shooting star in deep space at the midpoint of this episode, but I would have to go back and rewatch the episode again, something that in truth I don't really want to do, but that's the only way to be sure. Now for my subjective opinion. I just don't like this. All of the aforementioned issues, they annoy the hell out of me. It's distracting, it's jarring, it's a piss poor substitute for good classic style storytelling. It may be what people want nowadays, but it doesn't do anything for me, I'm afraid. My biggest problem with this episode, that story-wise, character-wise, tonally, stylistically and aesthetically, it has Star Trek Discovery written all over it, and that is a huge problem. You would have thought that CBS by now would have learnt their lesson from Star Trek Discovery, but clearly they haven't, or they've been totally hoodwinked by Kurtzman et al. If I wanted to watch something like Star Trek Discovery in everything but name, then I would watch Star Trek Discovery. But I don't want to watch Star Trek Discovery because it's crap, subjectively and objectively. Star Trek Picard, it started out alright. I felt like some of the mistakes of Star Trek Discovery style Star Trek, they were being avoided, and that was one of the reasons why I did give it a chance in the beginning. That and the fact that I was looking forward to seeing Jean-Luc Picard back on screen. If episode 4 is indicative of what the show is going to be from here on out, then I am really going to struggle to watch this, even if only for the purpose of documenting what these Hollywood hacks are getting up to in the episode. With this writing, it's still going to be difficult for me to review it. Is there anything good to say about this episode? Well, I thought the character of Elnor was mildly interesting. There's some promise there, at least at this point. I'm sure the character will be decimated and used for virtual signaling soon enough. The music is really quite good in this episode. It's reminiscent at times of Bear McCreary's music on Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica series, which I love, by the way, the music and the series. It was nice to see 7 of 9 back on screen after almost 20 years, I think it is. However, I'm not being fooled here. Her one line in the episode already indicated a lot. If you want the 7 of 9 from Voyager, then don't get your hopes up here. To paraphrase Patrick Stewart, this isn't the Star Trek you remember, and I don't think this will be the version of 7 that you remember either. My overall rating for this episode is a 1 out of 10. It's the worst yet, and a very poor episode of television overall. And with that, I will just say thank you for watching this review. If you like it, please click the thumbs up and share the link below. If you enjoy the channel, please consider subscribing as well as clicking the bell icon for notification of new content. And I will see you in the next video.